Okay, so we're going to look at finding percentages without a calculator. So on the screen you can see that we've got 6 circles, okay, and if you position them in this way it gives them some sort of meaning when we're actually working through it. So I'm just going to go through, just put in some percentages above them. So this one is 100%. Okay, this middle one just underneath is 50%, and then just underneath that is 25%. Okay, and if I need to go from 100% of a number, which is the whole amount, to 50%, all I need to do to get from here to here is divide by 2. So just cut it in half. And the same thing from 50% to 25%. 25 is half of 50, so I'm just going to halve it again to get 25%. Okay. Now the other ones over this side is 10% and 1%. And to get from 10% to 1%, there's 10 lots of 10 in 100. So I'm just going to divide by 10. And to get from 10 to 1, I do the same thing. I'm just dividing by 10. So just a little bit of a recap on halving and dividing by 10. So halving for a start, if I've got 30 and I want to cut it in half, all I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it by 2. So 2 goes into 3 once, remainder 1. 2 goes into 10 5 times. So that would be 15. Okay. You can always do the short division method or the bus stop method to divide by 2. If I'm going to look to divide something by 10, so let's say I've got 30 as my all of my number, and I want to divide that by 10, the decimal point comes after the whole number, okay? And simply to divide by 10, all you're going to do is you're going to move the digits back one space. So the 3 is going to go over here, 0 is going to go over here, sorry, and the 3 is going to come back to where the 0 is, so it would be 3.0. Now, mathematically, the numbers move all the times. Okay, so if my decimal point is here, and I'm going to divide it by 10, okay, if I put the decimal point in the middle of those 2 digits, I get the same answer, 3.0. So if I started off with 30%, my 10% is going to be 3. Okay, if I move all of the digits back one more space, the decimal point will end up being in front of the 3. Okay, so I'd need a placeholder there. So if I divide it by 10, it goes from 30 to 3. And if I divide it by 10 again, or divide it by 100, that would be 0.3. So hopefully you can see what's happening with that number. Mathematically, the decimal point never moves. Okay. It's the digits that move, place, position, when I divide it by 10. At the top here we did divide 30 by 2 to give me 15, that will give me my 50%. And if I want to half that again, well, half of 10 is 5, half of 5 is 2.5, so if I add that together I end up with 7.5. Now when you come to this one, I could do one of 2 ways. To get my 5% circle, I can either divide 15 by 10, or I can half 3. I can do either one. So again, coming down here, I'm just going to divide it by 2. So half of 3 gives me 1.5. Okay, so 1.5 is in that value there. If I divide 15 by 10, I get 1.5. So you can come from either angle on this one, whichever way that suits you. So let's look at the values we've got. We've put 30 in our 100%. So if we want to find a percentage of 30, let's say I want to find 10% of 30. Okay, simply I've put my 30 in here, I've divided by 10, and that value there, 3, is going to be 10% of 30. Let's say I wanted to find 15%. Okay, I haven't got a circle that is 15% on its own, but what I could do is I could say, well, let's take the 10% and let's take the 5% and let's add that together. So the 10% would be 3, the 5% would be 1.5, and if I add those two together, I get my 15%. So 3 plus 1.5 gives me 4.5. So 15% of 30 would indeed be 4.5. And it doesn't matter what percentage you need to calculate, you can always find this, especially if it's an integer value, a whole number value. Let's try something more difficult. So if I wanted to find 65% of 30. Okay, 65% of 30. I've got to think, how can I make 65 using the values of 100, 50, 25, 10, 5 and 1. So I could take 50%. Okay, I'm 15% short. I could take 10% and I could take 5%, and I could add all of those together and that would give me 65%. Well, 50% of 30 is 15, 10% of 30 is 3, and 5% of 30 is 1.5. And again, I'm just going to add those through. If you want to put placeholders there so you can keep the place value, then that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 1. So 65% of 30 would be 19.5. So let's try one. I'm going to put a new value into the circle and see if you can calculate the percentages. So let's put in 7, let's say 80. Let's put 80 in there. So can you find 50% of 80, 25% of 80, 10%, 1% and 5%? Pause the video, give it a go, and we'll come back in a second. Okay, let's see how we got on. If we cut 80 in half, that's going to give me 40. If I cut 40 in half, that's going to give me 20. If I divide 80 by 10, that's going to give me 8. If I divide 8 by 10, that's going to give me 0.8. And if I then half 8, that's going to give me 4. So that should be your circles completed. Now, can we find 30%, 70% and 95% of 80? Pause the video and see how you get on. Okay, let's see how you got on. To get 30%, I could say I need 25% and 5%. I could add those two together. So I've got 20 plus 4 is going to give me 24. To get 70%, I need 50% and 2 lots of 10. So 2 lots of 10 is 16. Add that to the 40. That's going to give me 70%. So that's 56. And if I wanted to find 95%, I could do 50% plus 25% plus 10% plus 10%. So I'm just going to write this one out. I could do 50% plus 25% plus 10% plus 10. And that would give me 95%. Okay. So 50% is 40, 25% is 20, 10% is 8, 10% is 8, and then just add it through. 16, 40, 50, 60, 70, 76 would be 95% of 80. Now when you get used to using this method, you can see other ways of maybe, there's not just one way to make 95%. You could say, well, if I take 100% and I take away 5%, that'll give me 95%. So I've got my 80, take away my 5%, which is 4, and that's going to give me 76. So you may find that slightly easier to do it that way around as well. Okay. Right, we're just going to look back at this percentage. We're not going to put another one in there, but if you wanted to find any percentage at all, and you quite like doing multiplication, if multiplication you find easier than addition and subtraction, then you could always find the 1% by taking the value you've got, dividing it by 100, which is what we've done in the top row of bubbles, and we've got 0.8. Now let's say we wanted 76% or 78%. We'll go 78%. If we wanted 78% of this, instead of listing down all the different variables that I need to get to 78, I could just take my 1% and I could just multiply it by 76. So if I've got 0.8, I'm going to do 76 times 0.8. 8 times 6 is 48. 8 times 7 is 56. And then I'm going to add the 4. That gives me 60. And remember, we've got one decimal place, one decimal point behind, number behind the decimal point. So my answer is 60.8. You could always just find the 1% and multiply whatever percentage you need. Hope that was useful, and I'll catch you next time.